The tree line was 30 meters away. Not a forest, just the thick hedgerow wall that divided this Norman field from the next. The same earthen barrier that divided every field from every other field in this part of France, that had been growing since before any of the men crouching near it had been born, that the planners in England had not fully accounted for when they imagined what the advance inland would look like. Behind it, behind the specific section that the crew had identified 20 minutes ago and driven toward with the care that surviving in this landscape required, the engine idled. The crew heard the tracks before they saw anything. The commander made the call. Not a long call. The Hellcat did not reward long deliberation. Its doctrine, its design, its entire reason for existing in this form rather than some other form, was built on the premise that the advantage belonged to whoever acted first and stopped acting in the same place immediately afterward. Fire. Move. The ground you just occupied was already a target. The ground you were moving to was still unknown to the enemy. The gun fired once. The Hellcat reversed into the lane behind it, turned, and was gone before the dust had settled over the position it had just abandoned. This was the M18 Hellcat, and almost everything about it, the things it did well, the things that made it dangerous, the things that made it fragile, came from a single decision made before the first plate of its armour was ever cut. It would be built to run. The M18 is not among the most celebrated American armoured vehicles of the Second World War. In the popular memory of the Western Front, the Sherman dominates the Allied armour story. The tank destroyer force, of which the Hellcat was a part, occupies a more complicated space in history. A force built around a doctrine that was partially right and partially wrong, that was formed in response to fears about mass German armour that proved both justified and differently shaped than anticipated, and that produced vehicles ranging from the adequate to the genuinely impressive without ever quite receiving the credit that the latter category deserved. The M18 sits in the genuinely impressive category. It is often overlooked because the circumstances under which it excelled aggressive flanking, rapid displacement, shoot and scoot engagements do not generate the kind of set-piece narrative that popular histories prefer. Its victories were often invisible in the records. A flank shot taken before the German crew knew what was shooting, a vehicle that was already elsewhere by the time return fire arrived, a problem solved so quickly that the after-action account had little to say beyond threat neutralized. To understand why the Hellcat was the way it was, you have to understand the doctrine it was built to serve. The United States Army's tank destroyer force was created around a specific tactical concept that had emerged from the early war experience of watching German armour operate. The concept was this: German armoured thrusts were a mass phenomenon. They concentrated armour at points of breakthrough and drove through defensive lines before the defence could reorganise. The answer was not to distribute anti-tank weapons evenly across the front, where they would always be outnumbered at the point of attack. The answer was a mobile reserve, a force that could move quickly to the point of penetration, concentrate its firepower, and break the armoured thrust before it could exploit its breakthrough. The vehicles that would perform this mission did not need to be tanks in the conventional sense. They did not need to trade shots at close range with enemy armour, absorbing punishment while delivering it. They needed to arrive faster than the armour they were countering, find the angles the enemy had not protected, deliver concentrated fire, and move again before the situation could turn against them. Speed was not a convenience in this doctrine. Speed was the primary form of protection. The M18 was designed around this premise with a consistency that is almost unusual in wartime procurement. Where many vehicles end up as compromises between competing requirements, more armour here, a heavier gun there, a larger engine to compensate for the additional weight, the M18 was a compromise in a different direction. Everything that added weight without adding to the fundamental mission of fast movement and hard hitting was reduced or eliminated. The result was a vehicle that was, by the standards of its contemporaries, startlingly light and correspondingly fast. On suitable roads, it could move at speeds that no German tank could match. Cross-country, in the terrain that combat actually occupied, the advantage was less dramatic but still meaningful. The Hellcat could get to a position, get away from a position, and get to the next one faster than the vehicles it was hunting could react. The gun the M18 carried was a high-velocity weapon suited to its anti-armour role. Against the medium German armour that constituted the bulk of what it encountered in realistic operations, it was effective at practical combat ranges. Against the heavier vehicles, the Tigers and the later Panthers, the engagement required more care. Favourable angles, closer ranges, patience in waiting for the shot that the armour could be made to permit. The Hellcat was not a weapon that could simply point itself at a Tiger's front plate and expect the outcome it wanted. It was a weapon that could manoeuvre to the side or rear of that Tiger, where the protection was different, and produce the outcome it needed from there. This distinction between what a weapon can do head-on and what a weapon can do when used as intended is at the centre of understanding what the M18 actually was. The protection the M18 carried was enough to stop small arms fire and not much else. This statement requires context, because not much else sounds like a condemnation and was not necessarily one. The open turret the M18 had no roof over its crew was a deliberate design choice, not a failure of engineering ambition. An enclosed turret added weight. Weight reduced speed. Speed was the protection. The open top also gave the crew something that fully enclosed vehicles sacrificed: awareness. The commander and the gunner could hear what was happening around them in a way that the interior of a sealed steel box does not permit. They could turn their heads and see threats that their optics might not have captured. In the specific kind of combat, the M18 was designed for rapid, close, decided in seconds that awareness had genuine tactical value. The vulnerability was equally real and required honest acknowledgement. Artillery fragments, which rained down on enclosed crews with reduced effect, entered the open-top turret without the steel overhead that would have deflected or slowed them. In close terrain, grenades and small arms fire from elevated positions presented a threat that an enclosed vehicle would have resisted more effectively. In winter, the crew was exposed to conditions that added exhaustion to the already significant demands of combat operations. The Hellcat's crews knew their vehicles' vulnerabilities. They adapted their tactics around them. They sought positions that minimized overhead exposure. They moved before they became targets for the artillery that the open top could not defend against. They used the speed that the light construction provided to spend as little time as possible in any single position where the limitations of their protection could be exploited. The second vulnerability was the consequence of being lightly armoured in engagements the doctrine had not anticipated, when the Hellcat was asked to hold ground rather than cover it, when the situation did not permit rapid displacement, when the enemy was already at close range before the crew knew they were there. In those circumstances, the M18's protection was genuinely insufficient, and the crews who found themselves in those circumstances knew it in the most direct terms available. If you're following this story, the doctrine, the design, the tension between what a vehicle was built to do and what the war sometimes asked of it, consider subscribing. There's more to come on the vehicles and decisions that shaped the Second World War. The Normandy campaign gave the M18 a landscape that suited its characteristics. The bocage, the Norman hedgerow country that surprised Allied planners with its resistance to conventional advance, was in many ways designed for the kind of warfare the Hellcat practiced. The compartmentalized terrain, divided into individual fields by walls of packed earth and dense vegetation, offered concealment at almost every position. The narrow lanes that connected fields channeled movement, which meant that the direction of any approaching vehicle was often predictable before the vehicle itself was visible. A crew that knew how to use this terrain could select a position, wait with the engine temperature managed and the gun laid on the most likely avenue of approach, and engage from cover at a range they chose rather than a range the enemy imposed. After the one shot, ideally the shot that ended the need for further engagement, the lane behind the position permitted rapid withdrawal before the smoke had cleared. The hedgerows that made conventional tank advance so difficult were, from the Hellcat's perspective, an asset. The same walls that stopped Shermans from crossing freely were the walls that hid the M18 between engagements. The same compartmentalization that confused larger formations gave the individual vehicle and its crew a landscape full of positions, fallback routes, and angles that a larger, slower vehicle could not exploit with the same fluency. The post-Normandy advance, as Allied forces broke out of the bocage into more open country, changed the tactical environment. Open terrain exposed the Hellcat's light protection more directly, reduced the concealment that the hedgerow country had provided, and placed more weight on the pure speed advantage. In this environment, the M18's ability to cover ground quickly to reposition across the front of an advance, to concentrate at points of resistance and disperse again before the enemy could bring fire onto the position became more prominent. The doctrine was tested in a different form, and the vehicle adapted to the test. Let us follow the commander through the calculation that the Hellcat's tactical situation produced many times each day. The intelligence, such as it was, suggested German armour somewhere beyond the next ridge. Not specific intelligence, the kind of specific, current, verified intelligence that allowed planning with confidence. The suggestive kind, built from the sounds of tracked vehicles moving at night, from the aircraft that had reported movement, from the general logic of what the German side would do with armour in this position given what the terrain offered. The commander knew what the Hellcat could do to a German medium tank at the range the ridge offered. He knew what a German anti-tank gun would do to the Hellcat if the anti-tank gun was on the ridge and the Hellcat was on the road leading up to it. He knew that the fastest route to the flank that would give him the shot he wanted crossed 200 metres of open ground that he had not been able to observe since the previous evening. Hold or move. Wait for more information or use the information he had. Accept the exposure of moving, or accept the possibility that the position he was currently occupying had already been identified and was being targeted. The doctrine said, move. The doctrine had been written by people who understood the vehicle's survivability in static positions and had made their calculation accordingly. The commander's job was not to improve on the doctrine in the moment. It was to execute it well enough to be alive to execute it again tomorrow. He moved. The Battle of the Bulge, in the winter of 1944 into 1945, tested the M18 in conditions that the doctrine of mobile anti-armour warfare had not been designed for. The German offensive through the Ardennes in December 1944 was, in its initial phase, exactly the kind of armoured breakthrough that the tank-destroyer concept had been conceived to counter. Concentrated German armour driving through weak points in the Allied line, moving faster than the defence could re-establish itself, exploiting terrain that had been considered unsuitable for a major offensive. The conditions were different from what the doctrine assumed. The roads were icy and reduced the speed advantage that the Hellcat relied on. The visibility was limited by weather that grounded the Allied air power that had been an implicit part of the overall anti-armour system. The front was confused in ways that made the orderly concentration of tank destroyer reserves against identified breakthrough points nearly impossible. In these conditions, the M18 was asked to do things it was not designed to do. Hold positions, anchor defensive lines, face German armour at ranges and angles that were not of the crew's choosing. Some crews held. The cost of holding in a vehicle with the Hellcat's protection, in the kind of close, confused fighting that the Ardennes produced, was real and serious. And yet the Hellcat's speed, even on winter roads, gave it a flexibility that heavier vehicles could not match. Units that were cut off could sometimes extract themselves by routes that the German armour following them could not follow at the same pace. Positions that were threatened could be reinforced from unexpected directions. The vehicle that had been built for mobility in the fluid offensive found that mobility retained value even in the defensive emergency that the Ardennes represented, in forms the original doctrine had not specifically anticipated. From the perspective of the German armour that encountered the M18, the experience was one of specific tactical disorientation. The standard expectation in an engagement against American armour was grounded in the characteristics of the vehicles most commonly encountered the Sherman in its various forms, whose protection and armament were known quantities that German crews had learned to assess and respond to. The Hellcat did not fit that template. Reports from German units engaging American tank destroyer forces in this period describe the confusion produced by a vehicle that appeared, fired, and relocated before the engagement had fully registered. The first sign of the M18's presence was often the impact of its round, delivered from a position that had not been identified before the shot, at an angle that suggested the vehicle had moved to a flank that the defensive position had not been organising against. The problem was not simply the individual engagement. It was the uncertainty that accumulated across multiple contacts with a vehicle whose location was never stable long enough to be confidently identified and targeted. A threat that moves continuously is a threat that consumes disproportionate attention and caution, pulling resources toward force protection and away from whatever the German formation was attempting to accomplish. The Hellcat was most effective not in any single spectacular engagement, but in the aggregate effect of many engagements conducted on its own terms, each one brief, each one initiated from a position of advantage, each one followed by displacement that reset the tactical situation before the enemy could respond effectively. The numbers associated with the M18's production and service reflect the confidence the American military had in the concept, even as the doctrine around tank destroyer forces was being reassessed in light of what the war in Europe was actually requiring. Considerable numbers of M18s reached American units in Europe, and their operational record was strong enough that the vehicle was regarded by the crews who used it as genuinely capable when employed as intended. The qualification matters. The M18 in an ambush on suitable terrain, operated by a crew that understood its doctrine and executed it with discipline, was a significantly different proposition from the M18, held in a defensive position and asked to absorb fire while the situation around it was resolved. The comparison context that places the Hellcat among American anti-armor options of the period is useful here. The M10, which mounted a capable gun on a heavier and less mobile chassis, represented an older approach to the tank destroyer concept. The M36, with its heavier gun suited to engaging the Tigers and Panthers that the M10 struggled with, gave up some of the mobility that the doctrine valued for the penetration that late war threats demanded. The Hellcat occupied a specific position in this spectrum, the fastest, most mobile option, with the lethality required against the majority of what it faced, trading protection and heavy armor penetration for the speed and agility that its doctrine made central. The correct interpretation of this position was not that the M18 was superior or inferior to these alternatives. It was that it filled a different part of the requirement, the part that valued speed as the primary form of survivability and aggressive positional warfare as the primary tactic. There is a shape to military success that popular history tends to misread. The stories that get told most often are the stories of vehicles that held their ground, that absorbed punishment and kept fighting, that were present at the end of the engagement in the position they had occupied at the beginning. Endurance and mass are qualities that translate easily into narrative. The M18 Hellcat's success does not translate easily into that narrative. Its victories were often the absence of the problem the threat neutralized before it could develop into the engagement that would have been costly. The column that reached its objective, because the resistance on its flank had been removed by a vehicle that was already 600 meters away by the time the column passed the position. The Hellcat was a vehicle whose best work was invisible in the sense that it prevented the battle that would have been fought if it had not been there. What it was not was invulnerable or infallible or suited to every situation the war produced. The battles in which it was asked to hold ground, to accept the engagement rather than choose it, to remain in position while the situation was resolved by forces other than its own mobility. Those battles showed the limits that the design had accepted in exchange for the speed that made it valuable. The lesson of the M18 is not that speed beats armor, or that mobility is always the answer, or that any single design philosophy is correct across all the situations that war produces. The lesson is that a vehicle designed honestly around a coherent doctrine, built to perform the role the doctrine describes rather than a generalized role that keeps all options open, will perform that role well if the doctrine is sound and the terrain and situation permit its application. The Hellcat was built to run, to shoot, and to run again. In the fields of Normandy, on the roads of the Low Countries, and in the confused defensive fighting of the Ardennes winter, it did exactly that. It did the job it was designed to do. In a war full of vehicles that never quite became what their designers intended, that is not nothing. It is, in fact, nearly everything.